There's nothing more heartbreaking than watching an innocent man face death while the truth stays buried in silence. Sometimes the most loyal friend you'll ever have walks on four legs and never says a word. In Deadman's Bluff, Jack Sullivan is about to hang for a murder he didn't commit. The whole town gathered to watch justice being served, but they're wrong about everything. Jack's horse Dustfire knows the real story, and this smart Mustang isn't going to let his best friend die. What this horse does next will shock everyone in town and prove that true loyalty knows no bounds. Can an animal save a man's life when all the humans have given up? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months earlier, when Jack Sullivan first rode into Deadman's Bluff, the morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street. His silver spurs, inherited from his father along with a code of honor as old as the frontier itself, caught the light as he dismounted outside Murphy's General Store. Behind him, Dustfire stood perfectly still, ears alert, dark eyes taking in every detail of their new surroundings. The magnificent Mustang had the kind of intelligence that made folks stop and stare, though most attributed it to good breeding rather than the remarkable mind that actually lived behind those thoughtful eyes. Jack had been drifting for nearly 2 years, moving from town to town ever since he'd hung up his deputy marshal badge in disgust. He'd seen too much corruption, too many innocent folks getting trampled by powerful men who twisted the law to suit their purposes. The badge had once meant something to him: justice, protection for those who couldn't protect themselves, but it had become a weight around his conscience. So he'd taken to the open road with nothing but his horse, his father's spurs, and a determination to find some corner of the world where decent people still mattered. Deadman's Bluff seemed promising enough. The town had grown up around a reliable water source and a crossroads that brought steady trade. Main Street stretched from the train depot on the east end to the church on the west, with everything a community needed in between: Murphy's store, the Frontier Saloon, Doc Peterson's office, the blacksmith shop, and a modest hotel that had seen better days. The sheriff's office sat right in the middle, a sturdy building with barred windows and an American flag that snapped smartly in the desert breeze. Sheriff Morrison was the first to approach Jack that morning, a middle-aged man whose belly strained against his vest, but whose eyes still held the sharpness of someone who'd kept the peace for many years. "Stranger in town," Morrison said, tipping his hat. "You planning to stay long?" "Depends on whether there's honest work to be found," Jack replied, extending his hand. "Jack Sullivan. This here's Dustfire." Morrison's grip was firm, his manner cautious but not unfriendly. "Frank Morrison. Sheriff here for 12 years now. What kind of work you looking for?" "Ranch hand, mostly. Good with cattle, better with horses. Dustfire and I. We understand each other in ways most folks wouldn't believe." As if to demonstrate, Dustfire stepped closer and nuzzled Jack's shoulder, a gesture of affection so perfectly timed it made Morrison chuckle. "That's quite a horse you've got there. Smart-looking animal." "Smartest I've ever known," Jack said, running his hand along Dustfire's neck. "Sometimes I think he understands every word we say." Dustfire whinnied softly, almost as if agreeing, and both men laughed. What they didn't know was that the horse had indeed understood every word, and was already forming impressions about the sheriff that would prove important in the months to come. Dustfire had a gift for reading people that went far beyond normal animal instinct. He could sense honesty or deception, kindness or cruelty, with an accuracy that would have amazed anyone who truly understood what they were witnessing. The Frontier Saloon's proprietor, Mary Beth Carson, emerged from her establishment just as the morning crowd began to stir. She was a woman of perhaps 35, with auburn hair pinned up practical-like and green eyes that missed very little of what happened in her town. She'd inherited the saloon from her late husband and ran it with a combination of firm authority and genuine warmth that made it the social center of Deadman's Bluff. New faces, she observed, approaching the group with a coffee pot in one hand and tin cups in the other. "You gentlemen look like you could use some refreshment." The coffee was strong and hot, exactly what Jack needed after a long ride. As they stood in the morning shade, Mary Beth studied him with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to judge character quickly. What she saw was a man in his early 30s, tall and lean from years in the saddle, with honest blue eyes and the kind of weathered face that spoke of someone who'd seen both the best and worst of human nature. His clothes were worn but clean, his manner respectful but confident. "I'm Mary Beth Carson," she said, offering him a fresh cup. "And you're the first newcomer we've had in months who doesn't look like he's running from something." "Jack Sullivan, ma'am, and I appreciate the coffee. Truth is, I'm not running from anything, I'm looking for something. A place where a man can do honest work and sleep with a clear conscience." Mary Beth glanced at Sheriff Morrison, who nodded almost imperceptibly. In small towns, such silent communications carried weight. "Well, Mr. Sullivan, you might have found it. Tom Bradley's been looking for someone to help with his cattle operation. He's got more land than he can manage alone, especially with Roundup coming." Tom Bradley turned out to be a man after Jack's own heart, honest, hard-working, and devoted to the idea that a man's word was his bond. His spread lay 5 miles south of town, a modest operation with good water and decent grazing. Bradley was in his 50s, his hair more grey than brown, but he still sat a horse like someone half his age. When Jack and Dustfire arrived at his ranch, Bradley spent more time evaluating the horse than the rider. "That's some animal," Bradley said, watching as Dustfire seemed to anticipate Jack's every command during an impromptu demonstration. "Never seen a horse move cattle with such intelligence. It's almost like he knows what each cow is thinking." Over the following weeks, Jack proved himself invaluable to Bradley's operation. Dustfire demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to work cattle, seeming to understand not just Jack's commands, but the broader purpose of each task. When they moved the herd to new grazing areas, Dustfire would position himself exactly where he was needed without being directed. When they worked the branding fires, the horse stayed alert for dangers that even experienced cowboys might miss. But it was Dustfire's behavior around people that truly set him apart. The horse showed obvious approval of honest folks like Tom Bradley, Preacher Williams, and Mary Beth Carson. With Sheriff Morrison, Dustfire remained polite but reserved, as if sensing some weakness in the man's character that others hadn't noticed. And when Silas Crane came around, the wealthy cattle baron who owned the largest spread in the county, Dustfire's ears would flatten against his head, and he'd position himself between Jack and the visitor in a way that seemed almost protective. Silas Crane commanded attention wherever he went. He owned nearly half the land in the county, employed dozens of men, and had the kind of political connections that made even the sheriff defer to his opinions. He was a big man with silver hair and piercing grey eyes, always impeccably dressed and perfectly groomed. But there was something about him that made Dustfire nervous, and Jack had learned to trust his horse's instincts completely. "Fine animal you have there, Sullivan," Crane observed during one of his visits to Bradley's ranch. "I could use a man with your skills on my spread. Pay you twice what Bradley can afford." "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Crane, but I'm happy where I am." Crane's smile didn't reach his eyes. Loyalty's admirable, up to a point, but a smart man knows when to recognize better opportunities. Throughout this conversation, Dustfire remained tense, his muscles coiled as if ready to spring into action. The horse's obvious distrust of Crane was so apparent that even Bradley noticed it. "Dustfire's usually friendly with everyone," Bradley commented after Crane had left. "Strange how he takes such a dislike to Silas." "Animals sense things we miss sometimes," Jack replied, though he couldn't have imagined how prophetic those words would prove to be. As autumn approached, Jack had found his place in the community. He attended church services with Tom Bradley, shared quiet conversations with Mary Beth over evening coffee, and earned the respect of the townspeople through honest work and decent behavior. Dustfire had become something of a local celebrity, known for his intelligence and his ability to find lost cattle or predict weather changes with uncanny accuracy. Judge Whitman, who rode the circuit and held court in Deadman's Bluff once a month, took particular interest in the horse during his visits. "Remarkable animal," he told Jack one evening. "I've seen many horses in my time, but none with such obvious intelligence. It's almost as if he understands human speech." If Judge Whitman had only known how accurate his observation was, the events that followed might have unfolded very differently. But for now, Jack Sullivan had found what he'd been searching for, a place where good people did honest work and looked out for one another. He and Dustfire were home at last, and the future looked bright as the endless prairie sky. Neither man nor horse could have anticipated the darkness that was about to fall over their peaceful new life, or the terrible test that would prove whether the bond between them was strong enough to overcome the worst kind of injustice. The morning of October 15th dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of blue sky that made a man grateful to be alive. Jack had risen early to help Tom Bradley check on some cattle in the north pasture, and they'd made plans to meet at sunrise near Willow Creek. Dustfire seemed unusually restless as they rode out, his ears constantly swiveling and his gait more alert than usual. Jack attributed it to the changing weather. Horses often got skittish before the first real cold snap of the season. They found Tom Bradley face down in the creek bed, his blood turning the clear water red. The sight hit Jack like a physical blow. Bradley had been more than an employer. He'd been a friend, a mentor, and one of the few genuinely good men Jack had known. Now he lay motionless among the rocks, his grey hair matted with blood, his eyes staring sightlessly at the morning sky. A few feet away, his horse grazed peacefully, seemingly unaware that its master would never ride again. Jack dismounted and knelt beside the body, checking for signs of life, even though he knew it was too late. Bradley had been shot twice in the back, execution style, and from the condition of the blood, he'd been dead for several hours. Near his body lay a bloodied bandana, one that Jack recognized with growing horror as identical to his own. Dustfire pawed at the ground nervously, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of death, and something else, something that made him whiny with distress. The horse began moving in circles around the creek bed, his behavior increasingly agitated, as if he were trying to communicate something urgent to Jack. But Jack barely noticed his horse's strange behavior. The shock of finding Bradley's body, combined with the sight of that bloodied bandana, had left him feeling sick and disoriented. He staggered back toward Dustfire, one hand pressed to his forehead as a sudden dizzy spell overcame him. The world seemed to spin, colors bleeding together like watercolors in rain. That's when he noticed the metallic taste in his mouth and the strange drowsiness that was creeping over him despite the morning hour. His vision began to blur, and he realized with growing alarm that something was very wrong. He tried to mount Dustfire, but his coordination was failing. The last thing he remembered was reaching for the saddle horn as his knees gave out beneath him. Dustfire caught his master's fall as best he could, cushioning Jack's collapse with his powerful body. The horse's distress intensified as Jack lost consciousness, whinnying loudly and pawing at the ground in frustration. Dustfire had seen what happened here during the night, had witnessed the real killer plant, the evidence, and slipped something into Jack's drinking water back at camp. But horses couldn't speak, couldn't point accusing hooves at murderers, couldn't explain the truth to humans who saw only what they expected to see. Sheriff Morrison arrived an hour later, responding to reports of gunshots heard during the night. He found Jack unconscious beside Bradley's body, his clothes stained with the dead man's blood, and that damning bandana lying just a few feet away. To Morrison's eyes, the scene told a clear story. Jack Sullivan had murdered Tom Bradley, probably for money or over some dispute, and had been too drunk or too stupid to get away clean. "Well, well," Morrison muttered, dismounting and drawing his gun. "Looks like we've got ourselves a murderer. Dustfire positioned himself between Jack and the sheriff, his ears flat against his head and his eyes showing white around the edges. The horse's message was clear. He was prepared to defend his unconscious master against anyone who tried to harm him. But Morrison had dealt with protective horses before, and he knew how to work around them without getting kicked. "Easy, boy," the sheriff said, circling wide. "Your master's in a heap of trouble, and there ain't nothing you can do about it." When Jack finally regained consciousness, he found himself in the Dead Man's Bluff jail, with no clear memory of how he'd gotten there. His head pounded like a blacksmith's anvil, his mouth felt full of cotton, and the sunlight streaming through the barred window seemed impossibly bright. Sheriff Morrison sat at his desk, filling out paperwork with the methodical care of a man who'd done this many times before. "Morning, Mr. Sullivan," Morrison said without looking up. "Sleep well? What happened? Where am I?" Jack struggled to sit up on the narrow cot, his head spinning with the effort. "You're in jail, son, charged with the murder of Tom Bradley." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. Memory came flooding back, finding Bradley's body, the bloodied bandana, the strange dizziness that had overwhelmed him. "I didn't kill Tom. He was my friend. I found him." "Save it for the judge," Morrison interrupted. "Found you passed out right next to the body, covered in his blood. Evidence, don't lie. That's impossible. I went to meet Tom, yes, but someone else killed him. Someone who wanted it to look like I did it." Morrison finally looked up, his expression skeptical. "And I suppose you just happened to pass out next to the body by coincidence?" Jack pressed his hands to his temples, trying to think through the fog in his brain. "I felt sick, dizzy, like I'd been drugged or something, or like you'd been drinking, found an empty whiskey bottle at your campsite." "I don't drink whiskey. Ask anyone in town, they'll tell you I never touch the stuff." But even as Jack protested his innocence, he could see that Morrison had already made up his mind. The sheriff had found him at the scene with blood on his clothes and what appeared to be damning evidence nearby. From Morrison's perspective, this was an open and shut case. Outside the jail, Dustfire's anguished whinnying could be heard throughout the town. The horse had followed the sheriff's wagon and now stood in the street, pawing at the dirt and calling for his master. Several townspeople had gathered, drawn by the commotion and the news that Tom Bradley was dead. "That horse ain't left that spot for 3 hours, Morrison observed. "Been making a racket the whole time." "He's trying to tell you I'm innocent," Jack said desperately. "Dustfire knows what really happened. If you'd just listen. Listen to a horse." Morrison laughed harshly. "Son, you're either crazy or you think I am." As word of the murder spread through Deadman's Bluff, the community's reaction was swift and decisive. Tom Bradley had been respected and liked by everyone, while Jack Sullivan was still a relative newcomer with no family or deep roots in the area. The evidence appeared overwhelming, and the townspeople's sense of justice demanded swift retribution. Mary Beth Carson was one of the few who questioned the obvious conclusion. She'd gotten to know Jack well over the past months, and nothing about him suggested he was capable of cold-blooded murder. But when she tried to express her doubts to other townspeople, she was met with skepticism and social pressure to accept the sheriff's version of events. "Evidence is evidence," Silas Crane declared at an impromptu town meeting that afternoon. "Tom Bradley was a good man, and his killer needs to pay the price. We can't let sentiment cloud our judgment." Crane's words carried weight in the community, and his call for swift justice resonated with people's anger over Bradley's death. What no one noticed was the satisfaction in his eyes as he spoke, or the way he seemed to relish the community's demand for Jack Sullivan's neck. Outside the jail, Dustfire continued his vigil, refusing food and water, ignoring attempts by well-meaning townspeople to lead him away. The horse's behavior was unprecedented. Most animals would have wandered off or been easily distracted, but Dustfire remained focused on the jail, with an intensity that made even skeptical observers uncomfortable. "It's like he knows what's happening in there," Doc Peterson commented to his wife that evening. "Never seen an animal carry on like that." "Animals know more than we give them credit for," she replied. Maybe that horse is trying to tell us something we're not smart enough to understand. As night fell over Deadman's Bluff, Jack lay on his narrow cot, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing as he tried to piece together what had happened. Someone had murdered Tom Bradley and framed him for the crime. That much was clear. But who would want Bradley dead, and why go to such elaborate lengths to pin the blame on a drifter with no enemies in town? The answer, when it came to him, made his blood run cold. Silas Crane had been pressuring Bradley for months to sell his land, making increasingly generous offers that Tom had consistently refused. Bradley's spread sat right in the middle of what would otherwise be a continuous tract of prime grazing land, and Crane had made no secret of his desire to acquire it. But Bradley had been adamant the land had been in his family for 2 generations, and he intended to keep it that way. Just last week, he'd told Jack about Crane's latest offer and his intention to refuse it, just as he'd refused all the others. "Some things ain't for sale," Bradley had said, "and this land is one of them." Now Bradley was dead, and Jack, the man who could testify about Crane's persistent efforts to acquire the property, was sitting in jail charged with murder. It was perfect, really. Crane would get the land from Bradley's estate, probably at a bargain price, and the only witness to his harassment campaign would hang for a crime he didn't commit. Outside in the street, Dustfire's lonely whinnying echoed through the night, a sound of grief and frustration that seemed to carry the weight of all the injustice in the world. The horse knew the truth, had seen it happen, but lived in a world where his testimony would never be heard or believed. Justice in Deadman's Bluff was about to become a travesty, and the only one who could prevent it was a magnificent Mustang that the human world considered nothing more than a dumb animal. The jail cell measured 8 feet by 6 feet, with stone walls that seemed to press closer together as the hours passed. Jack had been confined for 3 days now, and the isolation was beginning to wear on him as much as the knowledge that his life hung by a thread. He'd requested paper and ink to write letters, but Sheriff Morrison had denied the request, claiming it wasn't necessary for someone who'd be dead within the week. Outside his barred window, Dustfire maintained his vigil with the dedication of a sentry. The horse had created a small depression in the dirt from his constant pacing, and his refusal to eat or drink had become a source of concern, even among those who believed Jack was guilty. Several townspeople had tried to lead the animal away, but Dustfire would follow them only until the jail was out of sight, then break free and return to his post. "That horse is going to die if he keeps this up," Doc Peterson told Sheriff Morrison on the 3rd morning. "I've never seen an animal refuse food for so long." "Not my problem," Morrison replied, though his tone suggested he was beginning to feel uncomfortable about the situation. "Horse wants to starve himself. That's between him and his maker." The only visitor Jack was permitted was Preacher Williams, a soft-spoken man in his 60s who carried a worn Bible and genuine compassion for all of God's creatures. Williams had ministered to the condemned before, and he understood that sometimes the greatest service he could provide was simply to listen without judgment. "I appreciate you coming, Preacher," Jack said as Williams settled onto the wooden stool that served as the cell's only furniture other than the cot. "Means more than you know. Every soul deserves comfort in dark times," Williams replied, opening his Bible to a passage he'd marked with a faded ribbon. "Tell me about your horse, Jack. That animal's devotion is remarkable. Dustfire's special. Always has been. My father used to say some horses are born with old souls. They understand things that most animals never do. I've had Dustfire for 8 years now, and he's never let me down. Never." Williams nodded thoughtfully. "I've been watching him from my window. The way he positions himself, the way he responds to different people, there's an intelligence there that goes beyond normal animal behavior. You believe me, don't you, Preacher? About Tom's murder?" Williams was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands smoothing the pages of his Bible. "I believe you're telling me the truth as you know it, Jack. And I believe that horse knows something the rest of us don't." That afternoon, Williams made his way to Mary Beth's saloon, where a small group of townspeople had gathered to discuss the upcoming trial. The conversation stopped when he entered his presence, always commanded respect, even among those who didn't attend his services regularly. "Preacher," Mary Beth greeted him, setting down a glass she'd been cleaning. "Coffee? That would be welcome, thank you." Williams accepted the cup and took a seat at the bar. "I've been spending time with Jack Sullivan." "And?" Silas Crane looked up from his whiskey, his grey eyes sharp with interest. "And I find myself troubled by certain aspects of this case." The room grew quiet. Preacher Williams was known for choosing his words carefully, and when he expressed doubt about something, people paid attention. Such as, Sheriff Morrison had entered just in time to hear the comment. "That horse. For one thing, I've been observing animals for 67 years, Sheriff, and I've never seen behavior like this. It's as if Dustfire is trying to communicate something specific." "Communicate what?" Crane's tone had an edge to it. "I wish I knew. But yesterday I followed him when he left his post by the jail. He led me to 3 different locations around town, stopping at each one and pawing at the ground. At the creek where Tom was found, he became extremely agitated, circling one particular spot and whinnying." Mary Beth set down her cleaning rag. "What are you suggesting, Preacher?" "I'm suggesting that perhaps we should pay closer attention to what that horse is trying to tell us before we hang an innocent man." "Innocent?" Morrison's face reddened. "Evidence don't lie, Preacher. Found him at the scene, blood on his clothes, murder weapon nearby." "Murder weapon?" This was the first Jack had heard of any weapon being recovered. "Tom's own pistol," Morrison explained. "Found it in the creek, not 20 feet from where you were passed out." Williams frowned. "That seems odd, doesn't it? If Jack had murdered Tom, why would he use the victim's own gun and then leave it at the scene?" "Panic," Crane said smoothly. "Killers don't always think clearly after they've done the deed." But Williams had noticed something in Crane's expression, a flicker of satisfaction when the murder weapon was mentioned, as if he were pleased by this particular piece of evidence. It was subtle, probably invisible to anyone who wasn't trained to read human nature, but it troubled the preacher deeply. That evening, Williams returned to the jail to find Jack standing at his window, watching Dustfire's restless pacing in the moonlight. The horse's condition had deteriorated noticeably. His ribs were beginning to show, and his once glossy coat had lost its luster. "He's killing himself," Jack said without turning around. "I've never seen him like this." "Perhaps he's trying to save you the only way he knows how," Williams suggested. "By refusing to give up, refusing to accept what everyone else sees as inevitable." "I keep thinking about that morning. Something was wrong from the start. Dustfire was nervous, restless. Animals sense things we miss. He knew danger was nearby." Williams pulled out his Bible, but instead of reading from it, he set it aside and leaned forward. "Jack, I need you to think carefully. In the months you've been here, did anyone else show unusual interest in Tom's property? Anyone who might have had reason to want him gone?" Silas Crane made offers, lots of them. Tom always said no, and Crane didn't like being refused, but that doesn't make him a killer. "No, but it gives him motive. Combined with the fact that your presence in jail removes the one witness to his persistent harassment of Tom." "You think Crane set me up?" Williams was quiet for a moment. "I think someone did. The question is how to prove it when all the evidence points to you." Outside, Dustfire suddenly stopped pacing and raised his head, ears pricked forward as if hearing something in the distance. The horse moved to the edge of his patrol area and stood perfectly still, his body tense with attention. "Look at him," Williams whispered. "It's like he's listening to something we can't hear." What Dustfire was actually hearing was the sound of hoofbeats, a particular horse with an irregular gait caused by an old injury. The same horse he'd heard the night Tom Bradley died, the same horse whose rider had planted the evidence and poisoned Jack's water. Dustfire's exceptional memory for sounds and scents allowed him to identify individual horses from great distances, an ability that would prove crucial in the days to come. The horse's rider was Crane's foreman, Buck Torres, returning from a late-night errand at his boss's request. Torres was the kind of man who asked no questions and forgot what he'd seen for the right price. He'd been the one to carry out Crane's plan, and now he was reporting back on how the frame job was holding up under scrutiny. But Dustfire recognized both horse and rider, and his agitation increased as the familiar sounds grew closer. The Mustang began pacing again, his movements more urgent now, as if he were trying to draw attention to the approaching threat. "Something's got him worked up," Williams observed. Inside the jail, Jack pressed his face to the window, trying to see what had disturbed his horse. In the distance, he could make out a lone rider approaching the sheriff's office. Something about the scene filled him with dread, though he couldn't say why. "Preacher," he said urgently, "I need you to promise me something. If they hang me, if this goes wrong, take care of Dustfire. Don't let them turn him loose to starve. He deserves better than that." Williams gripped the bars of the cell. "Jack, don't talk like that. There's still time to find the truth. Time's running out, and we both know it. Promise me." The old preacher nodded solemnly. "I promise. But I also promise you this. I'm not giving up on finding the real killer. That horse of yours believes in your innocence, and if he's half as smart as I think he is, maybe I should be paying closer attention to what he's trying to show us." As if responding to his words, Dustfire whinnied loudly in the street, not the mournful cry of grief he'd been making, but a sharp warning call that any horseman would recognize as a danger signal. Something was coming to Dead Man's Bluff, and Dustfire knew it wasn't good. Judge Whitman arrived in Deadman's Bluff on the morning stage, his black traveling bag in one hand and a thick folder of legal documents in the other. He was a man who took the law seriously, having seen too many frontier communities where justice was dispensed from the barrel of a gun rather than through proper legal proceedings. At 62, he'd presided over hundreds of cases and prided himself on his ability to separate truth from fiction in even the most emotional circumstances. The courthouse was actually the back room of Murphy's General Store, hastily converted with borrowed chairs and a makeshift judge's bench fashioned from shipping crates. It wasn't much to look at, but Whitman had conducted trials in worse facilities. What mattered was the law, not the surroundings. Jack's trial began at 10 o'clock sharp, with most of the town crammed into the small space. Sheriff Morrison presented the evidence with practiced efficiency. Jack found unconscious at the murder scene, Tom Bradley's blood on his clothes, the bloodied bandana, and the victim's own pistol recovered from the creek. To any reasonable observer, it painted a clear picture of guilt. "Defense calls no witnesses and presents no evidence," Jack announced when his turn came. He'd refused the circuit lawyer's offer to represent him, preferring to speak for himself rather than let someone who didn't know him try to explain away what appeared to be damning evidence. "Mr. Sullivan," Judge Whitman said patiently, "I strongly advise you to reconsider. This is a capital case." "I understand that, Your Honor, but I won't waste the court's time with elaborate theories when the simple truth will suffice. I didn't kill Tom Bradley. He was my friend and employer. I found his body, and someone used that discovery to frame me for a crime I didn't commit. Can you prove this alleged frame-up?" Jack looked out the window, where Dustfire could be seen still maintaining his vigil. The horse had grown noticeably thinner, his once proud head now hanging lower, but his dedication remained absolute. "Only witness to my innocence can't testify in human courts, Your Honor." Judge Whitman followed his gaze to the horse and frowned thoughtfully. He'd noticed the animal's unusual behavior during his arrival, and the townspeople's comments about Dustfire's intelligence had intrigued him. Mary Beth Carson had positioned herself near the back of the courtroom, and when Whitman called for character witnesses, she stood up, despite the social pressure she knew she'd face. "Your Honor, I'd like to speak on Mr. Sullivan's behalf." "Mary Beth, sit down," Silas Crane said sharply. "This isn't the time for sentiment." But Whitman gestured for her to continue. "What would you like to tell the court, Mrs. Carson?" "Jack Sullivan has been a regular customer at my establishment for 6 months. In all that time, I've never seen him drink anything stronger than coffee. He's polite, respectful, and honest in his dealings. The man described in this trial, drunk, violent, capable of murder, bears no resemblance to the Jack Sullivan I know. Objection, Sheriff Morrison called out, though proper courtroom procedure was somewhat flexible in frontier justice. Character, don't change facts. Nevertheless, I'll note Mrs. Carson's testimony, Whitman said. Anyone else? Preacher Williams stood up. Your Honor, I've ministered to many men facing death, and I've learned to distinguish between the guilty who seek forgiveness and the innocent who seek justice. Jack Sullivan is not a killer. Again, character testimony, Morrison protested. Perhaps, Whitman replied, but I'm also interested in the preacher's observations about that horse. You mentioned some unusual behavior, Reverend Williams. Williams nodded eagerly. That animal has demonstrated intelligence far beyond normal horse behavior. It's almost as if he's trying to communicate specific information about the crime. Horses don't testify in murder trials, Crane interjected, drawing nervous laughter from some spectators. No, they don't, Whitman agreed. But I've seen enough of life to know that animals sometimes perceive things humans miss. What exactly has this horse been doing? Williams described Dustfire's behavior in detail, the refusal to eat or drink, the constant vigil, the apparent attempts to lead people to specific locations around town. As he spoke, Jack noticed something interesting. Silas Crane's expression grew increasingly uncomfortable, and he kept glancing toward the window where Dustfire was visible. Furthermore, Williams continued, I discovered something troubling yesterday when I visited the local records office. Tom Bradley had been receiving increasingly hostile letters about his refusal to sell his property, letters that were never mentioned in the sheriff's investigation. This was news to everyone, including Sheriff Morrison, whose face reddened with embarrassment. What letters? Tom showed them to me 3 weeks ago. Threats, veiled and otherwise, about what might happen if he continued to refuse certain offers for his land. Judge Whitman leaned forward with interest. Do you have these letters? Tom kept them in his safe at the ranch. I assumed Sheriff Morrison had recovered them during his investigation of the crime scene. All eyes turned to Morrison, who shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I searched the house thoroughly. Didn't find any letters. That's strange, Williams said mildly. Tom specifically mentioned putting them in his safe for safekeeping. Perhaps someone else knew about them. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. If someone had removed those letters from Bradley's safe, it suggested a level of premeditation and inside knowledge that didn't fit with the prosecution's theory of a spontaneous crime by a drunken drifter. Silas Crane stood up abruptly. Your Honor, this is all very interesting, but speculation about missing letters doesn't change the physical evidence. Jack Sullivan was found at the scene with blood on his clothes and the murder weapon nearby. Everything else is just desperate attempts to create doubt where none should exist. Mr. Crane raises a valid point, Whitman acknowledged. However, I find myself curious about these letters. Sheriff Morrison, I'm ordering you to conduct a thorough search of Mr. Bradley's property for any correspondence related to attempts to purchase his land. Already been through everything once, Morrison protested. Then you won't mind going through it again. Court will recess until tomorrow morning to allow time for this additional investigation. As the crowd began to disperse, Mary Beth approached the judge's bench. Your Honor, what about that horse? He hasn't eaten in days. If this continues much longer, I've been thinking about that, Whitman replied, glancing out at Dustfire. Reverend Williams, you seem to have developed something of a rapport with the animal. Could you attempt to provide it with food and water? I've tried, Your Honor. He won't accept anything from anyone. Jack, who was being led back to his cell by Morrison, called out, Dustfire will only eat if he thinks I'm safe. He's protecting me the only way he knows how. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the dusty street, Preacher Williams made another attempt to approach Dustfire with food and water. The horse acknowledged his presence with a soft whicker, but refused the offerings, just as he had refused everyone else's attempts to help. What Williams didn't know was that Dustfire had been surviving by making brief nighttime journeys to a small creek outside town, drinking just enough to stay alive before returning to his post. The horse's internal compass was remarkably precise. He could navigate in complete darkness and return to within a few feet of where he'd been standing. But more importantly, during these nocturnal excursions, Dustfire had been conducting his own investigation. His exceptional memory for scents and sounds had led him to several locations where he'd detected traces of the real killer. The problem was that humans couldn't interpret the evidence he'd discovered. Late that night, as most of the town slept, Dustfire made another of his reconnaissance trips. This time, his route took him past Silas Crane's ranch, where he detected familiar scents that confirmed his suspicions about the real murderer. Hidden in a barn was the irregular gaited horse whose rider had killed Tom Bradley. Nearby was equipment that still carried the scent of Bradley's blood. But when Dustfire tried to lead Preacher Williams to these locations the next morning, the man interpreted it as random wandering by a grief-stricken animal. The horse's frustration was palpable. He knew exactly where the evidence was hidden, knew who the real killer was, but lived in a world where his testimony was meaningless. At the same time, Sheriff Morrison was conducting his court-ordered search of Bradley's ranch, though his heart wasn't really in it. He'd been sheriff for 12 years and had never encountered a case with so much physical evidence pointing to one suspect. The missing letters that Preacher Williams had mentioned were probably nothing more than routine business correspondence that had been misfiled or thrown away. But what Morrison didn't know was that Buck Torres had already removed the threatening letters on Silas Crane's orders, along with other evidence that might have pointed to the real motive for Bradley's murder. The safe had been expertly opened, using information only someone with inside knowledge could have possessed. As Morrison went through the motions of searching, he found himself thinking about that horse. The animal's behavior really was unprecedented in his experience. Most horses would have wandered off or been easily distracted after a day or two. But Dustfire's devotion to his imprisoned master seemed to transcend normal animal instinct. "Maybe that preacher's right," Morrison muttered to himself as he rifled through Bradley's papers. "Maybe that horse does know something we don't." It was then that he found the hidden compartment in Bradley's desk, a small space behind a false back that contained Tom's personal journal and a collection of newspaper clippings about cattle rustling in the region. The journal entries from the weeks before Bradley's death painted a disturbing picture of escalating pressure and veiled threats. More significantly, the final entry was dated the day before Bradley's murder. SC came by again today with another offer, this one twice what the land's worth. When I refused, he said some things that sounded mighty close to threats. Told Jack about it afterward, figure, if something happens to me, at least someone will know who had motive. That horse of his was acting strange the whole time Crane was here, like he could sense something dangerous about the man. Morrison read the entry 3 times, his mind racing. If this journal was authentic and Bradley's handwriting was familiar enough to verify, then it cast the entire case in a different light. Jack Sullivan hadn't been a random killer, but a potential witness who'd been systematically eliminated from the equation. The sheriff looked around the empty ranch house, suddenly aware that his investigation might have been compromised from the beginning. If Silas Crane was involved in Bradley's murder, then the missing letters and other evidence hadn't been overlooked. They'd been deliberately removed by someone with the resources and connections to stay one step ahead of a small-town sheriff. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and Morrison could hear the distant rumble of thunder. Weather was coming, and with it, perhaps, a reckoning for the truth that had been buried beneath layers of carefully planted evidence. He tucked Bradley's journal into his vest pocket and headed back to town, his mind already working on how to present this new evidence to Judge Whitman without admitting that his original investigation had been fatally flawed. Meanwhile, Dustfire sensed the approaching storm and knew that time was running out. Tomorrow would bring Jack's sentencing, and unless something dramatic happened, his master would face the gallows within days. The horse raised his head toward the darkening sky and whinnied not the mournful cry he'd been making, but a sound of determination and resolve. Somehow, he would find a way to save the human who had given him purpose and love, even if it meant breaking every rule that governed the relationship between horses and men. Judge Whitman reconvened court the next morning, with Tom Bradley's journal spread open on his makeshift bench. The discovery had changed everything, though proving its implications would require careful consideration of all the evidence. Sheriff Morrison sat uncomfortably in the front row, acutely aware that his investigation was about to be scrutinized by a man who'd built his reputation on thoroughness and attention to detail. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whitman began, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades on the bench, "new evidence has come to light that requires us to examine this case more carefully." He read several passages from Bradley's journal aloud, including the final entry that mentioned both Silas Crane's threats and Jack Sullivan's role as a potential witness. The effect on the courtroom was immediate and dramatic: whispered conversations, shocked expressions, and more than a few meaningful glances in Crane's direction. Crane himself sat perfectly still, his face composed, but his knuckles white, where he gripped the back of the chair in front of him. When Whitman finished reading, Crane stood slowly and asked permission to address the court. "Your Honor, Tom Bradley was clearly under tremendous stress in his final weeks. These journal entries reflect the paranoid fantasies of a man who saw threats where none existed. Yes, I made offers for his property, generous offers that any reasonable businessman would have considered, but I never threatened him, never did anything that could be construed as coercion." "Nevertheless," Whitman replied, "these entries suggest that Mr. Sullivan's presence in town may have made him a target for whoever killed Mr. Bradley. Sheriff Morrison, did you find any other evidence during your second search?" Morrison cleared his throat nervously. "Found this hidden in Bradley's desk." He produced a small ledger book wrapped in oilcloth. "Appears to be some kind of accounting record, but the entries don't make much sense to me." Whitman examined the ledger carefully, his practiced eye taking in the neat columns of numbers and abbreviated notations. After several minutes, he looked up with a grim expression. "This appears to be a record of cattle sales and purchases, but the numbers don't match any legitimate operation I'm familiar with. Mr. Crane, are you familiar with this ledger?" "I've never seen it before in my life," Crane replied quickly. Too quickly, in Whitman's opinion. "Some of these entries reference your ranch, sir. Large numbers of cattle moving in and out at prices that seem unusually low." The courtroom grew quiet as the implications became clear. If Tom Bradley had been keeping records of suspicious cattle transactions involving Crane's operation, it provided another powerful motive for murder, one that went far beyond a simple land dispute. Outside the courthouse, Dustfire's condition had worsened visibly. The horse stood with his head hanging low, his ribs showing prominently through his dull coat. But his resolve remained unbroken, and when anyone approached the courthouse, his ears would prick forward with interest, as if he were hoping for news about his master's fate. Mary Beth Carson had taken to bringing him fresh water twice daily, even though he rarely drank more than a few sips. This morning, however, something was different. As she approached with the water bucket, Dustfire raised his head and looked directly at her with an intensity that made her stop in her tracks. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. "What are you trying to tell us?" In response, Dustfire took several steps away from his usual post, then stopped and looked back at her expectantly. When she didn't follow, he repeated the action, his message clear. He wanted her to come with him. Mary Beth glanced toward the courthouse, where she could hear Judge Whitman's voice continuing the proceedings. Then she looked back at the horse, whose intelligent eyes seemed to plead with her for understanding. "All right," she said softly. "Show me what you want me to see." Dustfire led her away from the main street, moving with more energy than he'd shown in days. His route took them past the blacksmith shop, around behind the church, and down toward the creek where Tom Bradley's body had been discovered. But instead of stopping at the murder scene, he continued upstream to a small grove of cottonwood trees that most townspeople avoided because of the boggy ground. There, half hidden beneath a fallen log, Dustfire began pawing at what appeared to be nothing more than disturbed earth. But as Mary Beth looked closer, she could see that someone had definitely been digging here recently. The soil was loose, dark, and clearly different from the surrounding ground. "What's buried here, Dustfire?" The horse whinnied softly and continued pawing, his actions becoming more urgent. Mary Beth knelt and began scraping away the loose dirt with her hands, not sure what she expected to find, but trusting the horse's instincts completely. What she uncovered made her heart race with excitement and fear. Wrapped in a piece of canvas were several items that clearly didn't belong in a random burial site. A bloody shirt, a distinctive pair of spurs that she recognized as belonging to Silas Crane's foreman, and most damning of all, a stack of letters tied with string. The letters were addressed to Tom Bradley, and their contents were far more threatening than anything Crane had admitted to in court. They detailed not just offers to purchase Bradley's land, but explicit threats about what would happen to anyone who interfered with Crane's expansion plans. The final letter, dated just 3 days before Bradley's murder, was particularly chilling. "Your continued refusal to see reason is becoming a problem that will require a permanent solution. I suggest you reconsider your position before someone gets hurt. And that includes your new friend Sullivan, who's been asking too many questions about cattle that don't concern him." Mary Beth sat back on her heels, the letters trembling in her hands. Here was proof of Crane's motive, evidence that Jack had been framed specifically because he posed a threat to whatever illegal operation Crane was running. But more than that, here was vindication of Dustfire's incredible intelligence and loyalty. "You knew," she whispered to the horse. "You've known all along where the evidence was hidden." Dustfire nickered softly and nuzzled her shoulder, the first sign of contentment he'd shown since Jack's arrest. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to drink deeply from the creek while Mary Beth gathered up the buried evidence. Back at the courthouse, Judge Whitman was growing increasingly troubled by the inconsistencies in the case against Jack Sullivan. The combination of Bradley's journal entries, the mysterious ledger, and the absence of any clear motive for the accused created reasonable doubt in his mind. But without additional evidence, he would have little choice but to proceed with sentencing based on the physical evidence that placed Jack at the crime scene. That's when Mary Beth burst through the courthouse doors, her dress muddy and her face flushed with excitement and exertion. "Your Honor," she called out, ignoring the breach of courtroom etiquette, "I have evidence that changes everything." The courtroom erupted in confused voices and shuffling feet as Mary Beth approached the bench with her bundle of evidence. Silas Crane rose from his seat, his face pale and his composure finally cracking. "This is highly irregular," he protested. "Court is in session." "Court will hear whatever evidence Mrs. Carson has discovered," Whitman ruled firmly. "Proceed, madam." Mary Beth spread the contents of her bundle on the judge's bench, explaining how Dustfire had led her to the burial site and what she'd found there. As she read the threatening letters aloud, the courtroom grew deadly quiet. The final letter, with its explicit threat against Jack Sullivan, caused an audible gasp from the spectators. Here was proof that Jack hadn't been a random target, but had been deliberately framed to silence him. "Mr. Crane," Whitman said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "these letters bear your signature. How do you explain their contents?" Crane stood slowly, his mind racing as he tried to formulate a response that might save him from the trap that was closing around him. But before he could speak, Sheriff Morrison stood up and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I believe I need to arrest Mr. Crane on suspicion of murder." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Silas Crane, the most powerful man in the county, was about to be charged with the same crime that had put Jack Sullivan in jail. And the evidence that would convict him had been discovered by a horse that the human world had dismissed as nothing more than a grieving animal. Outside the courthouse, storm clouds continued to gather, and the first drops of rain began to fall on the dusty street. But for the first time in days, there was hope in the air, carried on the wind like a promise that justice might finally be served. Dustfire raised his head toward the courthouse and whinnied not the mournful cry of the past week, but a sound of triumph and vindication. His master would be freed, the real killer would face justice, and the bond between horse and man would be proven stronger than all the lies and deception that had tried to tear them apart. The rain that had been threatening all morning finally began in earnest as Sheriff Morrison approached Silas Crane with handcuffs. But Crane wasn't finished fighting, and his years of wielding power in Dead Man's Bluff had taught him that sometimes the best defense was a calculated offense. "This is preposterous," Crane declared, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "Those letters could have been planted by anyone. And even if I wrote them, which I'm not admitting, heated words in business negotiations don't constitute murder." Judge Whitman studied the letters more carefully, his legal mind working through the implications. "Mr. Crane, the final letter specifically threatens Mr. Sullivan by name. How would you explain that?" Sullivan was asking questions around town about cattle transactions. As the largest rancher in the county, I naturally had concerns about someone investigating my business dealings. "That doesn't make me a killer." Mary Beth stepped forward, still holding the muddy spurs she'd found buried with the letters. "These belong to Buck Torres, your foreman. They were buried with the evidence of your threats." For the first time, Crane's composure cracked completely. His eyes darted toward the courtroom door as if calculating the distance, but Sheriff Morrison had positioned himself to block any escape route. "Buck Torres has worked for me for 8 years, Crane said desperately. "If he was involved in Tom Bradley's death, it was without my knowledge or consent." "Convenient," Whitman observed dryly. "And where is Mr. Torres now?" The question hung in the air unanswered. In fact, Torres had disappeared from Crane's ranch the previous night, taking with him a sizable amount of cash from Crane's safe and leaving behind only a note that Crane had burned before anyone else could read it. Outside the courthouse, Dustfire had finally allowed himself to drink deeply from the water bucket Mary Beth had left for him. The horse's behavior had changed dramatically since she'd returned from the burial site. He was more alert, more hopeful, as if he sensed that his desperate vigil was finally bearing fruit. Preacher Williams, who had been watching the proceedings with growing amazement, approached the window where he could see the horse. "Remarkable," he murmured to Doc Peterson, who had squeezed into the crowded courtroom. "That animal led her directly to evidence that clears Jack and implicates Crane. How is such intelligence possible?" "I've been thinking about that," Peterson replied quietly. "Horses have memories that far exceed our understanding. They can distinguish between hundreds of different scents, recognize individual voices from great distances, remember routes they've traveled only once. If Dustfire witnessed Bradley's murder, he could identify the killer by scent, by the sound of his horse's gait, by dozens of sensory details we'd never notice." The two men looked out at Dustfire with new respect. What they'd witnessed wasn't just animal loyalty, it was intelligence and deductive reasoning that rivaled human capabilities. Inside the courtroom, Judge Whitman was studying the muddy horseshoe that Mary Beth had also recovered from the burial site. Unlike the other evidence, this seemed less immediately significant until he noticed something unusual about its shape. "Sheriff Morrison, does Mr. Torres's horse have any distinctive characteristics?" Morrison thought for a moment. "Old injury to the left foreleg, gives him an irregular gait, and I believe the blacksmith had to specially modify his shoes to compensate." Whitman held up the muddy horseshoe, pointing to its unusual shape. "Like this modification?" The sheriff examined the shoe carefully and nodded. "That's Buck's work, all right. Only horse in the county that needs that particular type of corrective shoeing." The net was closing around Crane, and he knew it. But he had one last card to play, one that might at least create enough confusion to allow him to escape. "Your Honor," he said, standing with as much dignity as he could muster, "I request permission to retrieve some documents from my ranch that might clarify my business relationship with Tom Bradley. Documents that could explain these alleged threatening letters in their proper context." Whitman considered the request. "Sheriff Morrison will accompany you to retrieve these documents. Court will recess for 1 hour." It was exactly what Crane had been hoping for. Once outside the courthouse and away from the crowd, he would have opportunities that didn't exist in the confined space of the courtroom. Morrison was a decent lawman, but not particularly quick-thinking, and Crane had resources scattered around the county that could help him disappear permanently. But as they prepared to leave, Dustfire's behavior changed again. The horse, who had been relatively calm since Mary Beth's discovery, suddenly became agitated. His ears flattened against his head, and he began pacing in tight circles, whinnying with what sounded like warning calls. "What's got into that horse now?" Morrison wondered aloud. Preacher Williams, who had been observing Dustfire's reactions throughout the crisis, stepped out of the courthouse. "Sheriff, I believe that horse is trying to warn us about something. Every time he's acted like this, it's preceded some significant development in the case." "You think a horse can predict the future now?" "I think that horse has been right about everything so far, and maybe we should pay attention to what he's trying to tell us." Dustfire's agitation intensified as Crane approached his waiting horse. The Mustang positioned himself between Crane and the mounting block, his body language unmistakably threatening. When Crane tried to move around him, Dustfire shifted position, maintaining the barrier. "Get that animal away from me," Crane snapped, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking completely. But instead of complying, Morrison found himself studying Dustfire's behavior with new interest. The horse wasn't just being difficult, he was deliberately preventing Crane from leaving, as if he understood that allowing the man to reach his ranch would be a mistake. "You know what?" Morrison said slowly. "Maybe we should have someone else retrieve those documents. Deputy Wilson can ride out to your place while you remain here in custody." Crane's face went white. "That's completely unnecessary. I gave my word." "And that horse seems to think your word isn't worth much," Morrison replied. "Dustfire's been right about everything else. I'm inclined to trust his judgment on this too." The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Silas Crane, who had built his fortune on the premise that animals were property to be bought and sold, was being thwarted by a horse whose intelligence had exposed his crimes and now threatened to prevent his escape. As Deputy Wilson rode off toward Crane's ranch to retrieve the promised documents, Dustfire finally relaxed. The horse seemed to understand that the immediate danger had passed, and he allowed himself to accept food for the first time in over a week. Inside the jail, Jack Sullivan pressed his face to the barred window, watching the drama unfold in the street below. He couldn't hear the conversations, but he could see Dustfire's animated behavior and the way the townspeople were treating his horse with new respect. "What's happening out there, boy?" he whispered, though he was beginning to suspect that his long nightmare might finally be coming to an end. When Deputy Wilson returned from Crane's ranch 2 hours later, his expression was grim. Instead of the exonerating documents Crane had promised, he'd found evidence of a hasty departure, an empty safe, missing clothes and weapons, and clear signs that someone had been preparing to flee the county permanently. More significantly, he'd found Buck Torres's body in the barn, shot once in the back of the head, apparently silenced permanently to prevent him from implicating his boss in Tom Bradley's murder. Judge Whitman listened to Wilson's report with growing anger. "Mr. Crane, it appears you've been planning to flee rather than face justice. And now we have a second murder to add to the charges against you." Crane's final gambit had failed completely. The documents he'd promised didn't exist. His foreman was dead, and the horse he'd dismissed as a dumb animal had prevented him from escaping to fight another day. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, the pieces of the conspiracy fell into place. Crane had been rustling cattle throughout the region, using his legitimate ranch as cover for the illegal operation. Tom Bradley had discovered the scheme and threatened to expose it, signing his own death warrant. Jack Sullivan, whose background as a former lawman made him dangerous, had been framed for the murder to eliminate him as a witness. It was a plan that should have worked perfectly, except for one factor that Crane had never considered: the extraordinary intelligence and loyalty of a Mustang named Dustfire, who had witnessed the truth and refused to let it be buried beneath layers of lies and false evidence. As the sun set over Dead Man's Bluff, the rain finally stopped, and the first stars appeared in the clearing sky. Justice was about to be served, not through the cold calculations of human law, but through the warm loyalty of an animal who had never stopped believing in his master's innocence. The truth that emerged over the next several hours painted a picture far more complex and sinister than anyone in Dead Man's Bluff had imagined. As Judge Whitman continued his investigation into Silas Crane's activities, the scope of the conspiracy began to reveal itself like layers of sediment exposed by a flash flood. Deputy Wilson had found more than just Buck Torres's body at Crane's ranch. Hidden in a secret compartment beneath the barn floor was a collection of documents that detailed a cattle rustling operation spanning 3 states. Crane hadn't just been stealing cattle, he'd been running an organized criminal enterprise that involved corrupt officials, false bills of sale, and a network of accomplices that reached from Texas to Montana. Tom Bradley's ledger, which had seemed confusing when first discovered, suddenly made perfect sense. Bradley hadn't been recording his own transactions, he'd been documenting Crane's illegal activities, building a case that would have sent the cattle baron to prison for decades. Tom was smarter than any of us realized, Judge Whitman observed as he studied the evidence. He wasn't just refusing to sell his land, he was conducting his own investigation into Crane's operation. Jack's father's compass, which he'd carried since his days as a deputy marshal, had been among his personal effects confiscated when he was arrested. Now, as Sheriff Morrison returned his belongings, Jack held the compass with new appreciation for its symbolic significance. It had always pointed toward true north, just as his moral compass had always pointed toward justice, even when the world seemed determined to prove him wrong. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Among Crane's papers, Whitman discovered correspondence with officials in 3 different counties, revealing that the corruption extended far beyond Dead Man's Bluff. Several sheriffs, a federal judge, and even a territorial governor were receiving regular payments to look the other way, while Crane's organization operated with impunity. "My God," Whitman breathed as he read through the letters. "This isn't just cattle rustling, it's a conspiracy that reaches to the highest levels of territorial government." The implications were staggering. If Crane's network was as extensive as the documents suggested, then Jack Sullivan had been more than just an inconvenient witness. He'd been a mortal threat to an operation worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Mary Beth Carson, who had been quietly organizing the evidence with the methodical care of someone accustomed to managing complex business records, looked up from a stack of financial documents. "Judge Whitman, you need to see this." She handed him a leather-bound notebook filled with names, dates, and monetary amounts. It was Crane's personal record of bribes paid to officials throughout the territory, including some that made Whitman's blood run cold. "Judge Harrison in Territorial District 3, he read aloud, his voice tight with controlled anger. Judge Harrison sentenced 12 men to hang for cattle rustling in the past 2 years. Men who may have been innocent scapegoats protecting Crane's operation. The room fell silent as the full scope of the injustice became clear. Crane hadn't just framed Jack Sullivan. He'd been framing innocent men for years, using corrupt officials to eliminate anyone who threatened his criminal enterprise. Outside the courthouse, Dustfire had finally begun to eat normally, his appetite returning as the stress of his master's situation lifted. The horse seemed to sense that the crisis was passing. though he maintained his vigil with the patience of someone who understood that justice sometimes moved slowly. Preacher Williams approached the horse with a handful of fresh hay, marveling at the intelligence that had been dismissed by so many people for so long. "You knew all along, didn't you, boy? You saw what happened, and you've been trying to tell us ever since." Dustfire accepted the hay gratefully, his dark eyes reflecting a depth of understanding that went far beyond normal animal awareness. As Williams watched, the horse moved to the courthouse window and peered inside, as if checking on the progress of the proceedings that would determine his master's fate. Inside the jail cell, Jack Sullivan sat on his narrow cot, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Dustfire had accomplished. His horse had not only saved his life, but had exposed a conspiracy that might have continued for years, claiming countless innocent victims. "I always knew you were special," he whispered toward the window, though he couldn't see Dustfire from his cell. "But I never imagined how special." The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew everyone's attention to the street outside. A group of federal marshals was riding into town, led by a man whose reputation for honesty and competence was legendary throughout the territory. Marshal James Crawford had received an urgent telegram from Judge Whitman requesting federal assistance, and he'd ridden hard from Denver to reach Dead Man's Bluff before Crane's co-conspirators could destroy evidence or disappear. Crawford was a man in his 50s, with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He'd spent 20 years tracking down criminals who thought they were too smart or too well-connected to face justice, and his arrival in Dead Man's Bluff signaled that the investigation was entering a new phase. "Judge Whitman," Crawford said as he dismounted and tied his horse to the courthouse hitching post, "your telegram mentioned a conspiracy involving territorial officials. How extensive is this thing?" Whitman handed him Crane's bribery records. "See for yourself, Marshal. We're looking at corruption that reaches into the highest levels of government." Crawford studied the documents with the practiced eye of someone who had seen every form of criminal deception imaginable. After several minutes, he looked up with an expression of grim determination. "Gentlemen, we're going to need to move quickly. If word of this investigation reaches the wrong people, evidence will disappear and witnesses will die. I'm placing Silas Crane in federal custody, and I'm issuing warrants for everyone named in these records." As Crawford spoke, Dustfire's behavior changed again. The horse's ears pricked forward, and he began moving restlessly, his attention focused on something in the distance that the humans couldn't detect. "What's he doing now?" Crawford asked, noticing the horse's agitation. "He's been our early warning system throughout this entire investigation," Mary Beth explained. "Every time he acts like this, something significant is about to happen." Crawford looked skeptical until he heard the distant sound of rapid hoofbeats approaching from the north. A lone rider was coming fast, pushing his horse hard across the open prairie toward town. "Expecting anyone?" Crawford asked Whitman. "No one who'd be riding like that." The rider turned out to be a young man named Billy Morrison, the sheriff's nephew, who worked as a telegraph operator in the county seat 20 miles away. He'd ridden straight through to bring news that would change everything. "Uncle Frank," he called as he dismounted near the courthouse. "I got word from the federal marshal's office in Denver. They're saying Silas Crane is wanted in connection with a dozen murders across 3 states, and there's a federal warrant out for his arrest." The news hit the gathered crowd like a thunderbolt. Crane wasn't just a local criminal. He was a wanted fugitive whose crimes extended far beyond cattle rustling and the murder of Tom Bradley. Judge Whitman turned to look at Crane, who had gone pale and seemed to shrink into himself as the walls of his carefully constructed empire finally collapsed around him. "Mr. Crane," Whitman said formally, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and federal crimes that will be determined by higher courts than mine." As the handcuffs clicked shut around Crane's wrists, he looked out at Dustfire with something approaching respect in his eyes. "I should have killed that horse when I had the chance," he said quietly. "You should have lived an honest life," Marshal Crawford replied. "Then that horse would never have needed to expose your crimes." The greatest irony of all was that Silas Crane, who had built his fortune on the buying and selling of animals as commodities, had been brought down by a horse whose intelligence and loyalty had proven more valuable than all the gold and cattle in the territory. As Crane was led away to await transport to federal prison, Jack Sullivan was finally released from his cell. The moment he stepped into the street, Dustfire came running with a burst of energy that seemed impossible for a horse who had barely eaten in over a week. The reunion between man and horse was watched by the entire town, and there wasn't a dry eye among the spectators as Dustfire nuzzled his master's face and Jack wrapped his arms around the Mustang's neck. "I'm sorry, boy," Jack whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry you had to go through this." But Dustfire seemed to understand that the ordeal was over, that justice had been served, and that the bond between them had emerged stronger than ever. The horse had saved his master's life, not through strength or speed, but through intelligence, determination, and an unshakable faith in the truth. Marshal Crawford approached the pair, his hard features softened by the obvious devotion between horse and man. "Mr. Sullivan, I've read your background. You were a deputy marshal before you came here." "Yes, sir, until I got tired of watching corrupt officials pervert justice for their own gain. Well, I could use a man with your integrity and your obvious talent for investigation. And from what I've seen today, that horse of yours would be a valuable asset to any law enforcement operation." Jack looked at Dustfire, whose ears were pricked forward with interest, as if the horse understood the conversation and was curious about what the future might hold. "What did you have in mind, Marshal?" "Federal deputy, there are a lot of cases like this one, scattered across the territory, organized crime, masquerading as legitimate business, corrupt officials protecting criminal enterprises. You and Dustfire make quite a team." The offer was tempting, and Jack could see possibilities in it that appealed to his sense of justice. But he also looked around at the townspeople who had gathered to witness his release. Mary Beth with her warm smile, Preacher Williams with his gentle wisdom, Sheriff Morrison with his newfound respect for animal intelligence. "Can I think about it?" Jack asked. "Of course, but don't take too long. There are innocent men sitting in territorial prisons right now, convicted on Crane's false testimony. They need someone who understands how these conspiracies work, and someone with a partner who can sniff out lies from a mile away." As if responding to the compliment, Dustfire whinnied softly and butted Jack's shoulder with his nose. The horse seemed to approve of the idea, perhaps sensing that it would allow them to continue the work they'd started in Deadman's Bluff, protecting the innocent and exposing those who used power and corruption to pervert justice. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reflected off the windows of the buildings lining Main Street. It had been exactly 1 week since Jack's arrest, 7 days that had transformed a simple case of murder into the exposure of a criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. But more than that, it had been a week that proved the power of loyalty, intelligence, and an unshakable faith in truth. A horse that the world dismissed as a dumb animal had demonstrated reasoning abilities that shamed many humans. And his devotion to his master had saved not just one innocent man, but potentially dozens of others who had been wrongly convicted by Crane's network of corrupt officials. Judge Whitman approached Jack and Dustfire, carrying the compass that had been among Jack's confiscated belongings. "I believe this belongs to you," he said, handing over the instrument that had belonged to Jack's father. Jack opened the compass and watched the needle swing toward magnetic north, just as it always had. "Funny thing about this compass," he said thoughtfully. "No matter how lost you get, no matter how far you wander from the right path, it always points toward true north. Sometimes I think that's what Dustfire is for me, my moral compass, always pointing toward what's right." As if understanding the sentiment, Dustfire nuzzled Jack's hand where it held the compass, creating a moment of perfect symmetry between the instrument that pointed toward true north and the living creature who had always pointed toward true justice. The crowd began to disperse as darkness fell over Deadman's Bluff, but the story of what had happened would be told and retold for generations. It would become a legend of the Old West, passed down through families and shared around campfires, the story of a cowboy who was saved from the gallows by his horse, and how that horse's intelligence and loyalty had exposed a conspiracy that threatened the very foundations of justice in the territory. But for Jack Sullivan and Dustfire, it wasn't a legend yet. It was simply the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, a chance to continue the work that had brought them together in the first place, standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, and proving that sometimes the most powerful force in the world is the unbreakable bond between two souls who understand each other completely. 3 weeks had passed since Silas Crane's arrest, and the wheels of federal justice were turning with methodical precision. Marshal Crawford had established temporary headquarters in Deadman's Bluff, using the town as a base of operations while his team rounded up the remaining members of Crane's criminal network. The scope of the conspiracy had proven even larger than initially suspected, with connections reaching into 7 territories and involving over 50 corrupt officials. Jack Sullivan had accepted Crawford's offer to become a federal deputy, and he'd been spending his days helping to unravel the complex web of criminal activity that Crane had built over nearly a decade. Dustfire had proven invaluable in these investigations, his exceptional ability to detect deception, making him an unofficial lie detector whose accuracy exceeded any human interrogation technique. The horse's reputation had spread throughout the territory, and lawmen from other jurisdictions had begun requesting his assistance in difficult cases. Dustfire seemed to understand his new role perfectly, approaching each investigation with the same intelligence and dedication he'd shown in clearing Jack's name. But today was different. Tom Bradley's gold pocket watch, which had been recovered from Crane's ranch along with other stolen items, sat on Marshal Crawford's desk as a reminder of the man whose murder had started this entire investigation. Inside the watch was a photograph of Bradley's late wife, a woman whose gentle smile spoke of the happiness that Crane's greed had destroyed. "We're close to having everyone," Crawford told Jack as they reviewed the list of suspects still at large. "But there's one more piece of this puzzle that's been bothering me." "What's that?" "The timing of Bradley's murder. Crane had been pressuring him for months, but something made him decide that particular night was the right time to act. Something urgent enough to risk everything on a plan that depended on framing you." Jack had been wondering about the same thing. The murder had seemed almost spontaneous, despite the careful preparation that had gone into framing him. Maybe Bradley discovered something that forced Crane's hand. "That's what I'm thinking, and I believe the answer is in that pocket watch." Crawford opened the watch and carefully examined the photograph inside. It showed a young woman with dark hair and kind eyes, obviously taken many years earlier. But when he looked more closely, he noticed something that had been missed during the initial investigation. "Jack, look at this. There's writing on the back of this photograph." The faded ink was barely visible, but under a magnifying glass the words became clear. "Sarah Bradley. If anything happens to me, the truth is buried where we first kissed. Tom." The two men looked at each other with growing excitement. Tom Bradley had left a message for his deceased wife, knowing that if he was killed, someone would eventually find the watch and discover his final communication. "Where did Tom and Sarah first meet?" Crawford asked. "According to Mary Beth, they met at a church social when they were both young, but she's been dead for 5 years now, so that doesn't help us much." "Unless—" Crawford stood up and began pacing. What if he wasn't talking about where they first met, but where they first kissed? That could be anywhere. Jack thought about Tom Bradley, the quiet, methodical man who had become his friend and employer. Bradley wasn't the type for grand romantic gestures or secret hiding places. He was practical, straightforward, someone who believed in keeping things simple. "The cemetery," Jack said suddenly. "Tom visited Sarah's grave every Sunday after church." If there was some place that held special meaning for both of them, some place he'd consider appropriate for hiding important information, her grave site. They found Preacher Williams at the church, where he was preparing for the evening service. When they explained what they'd discovered in Tom's pocket watch, his eyes lit up with understanding. "Oh my," he said softly. "Tom proposed to Sarah beside her family's plot in the cemetery. He told me once that he'd chosen that spot because he wanted her ancestors' blessing on their marriage. If he was going to hide something important, that's exactly where he'd put it." The three men made their way to the cemetery as the sun began to set, painting the weathered headstones in golden light. Sarah Bradley's grave was marked by a simple stone cross with her name and the dates of her birth and death. But as they examined the area around the grave, they found evidence of recent digging near the base of an old oak tree that stood guard over the family plot. Jack began excavating while Crawford and Williams kept watch. About 2 feet down, his shovel struck something hard, a metal box wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. Inside was a collection of documents that represented the final piece of Tom Bradley's investigation into Crane's criminal enterprise. The most significant item was a detailed map showing the locations of Crane's illegal cattle operations throughout the territory. Bradley had spent months documenting the routes used to move stolen cattle, the corrupt officials who provided protection, and the legitimate businesses that served as fronts for the criminal activities. But the truly damning evidence was a series of photographs that Bradley had taken using a camera borrowed from the traveling portrait photographer who visited Deadman's Bluff twice a year. The photographs showed Crane and his men in the act of altering cattle brands, loading stolen animals onto trains, and meeting with officials who were supposed to be investigating cattle rustling rather than facilitating it. "My God," Crawford breathed as he examined the photographs. Tom documented everything. This evidence could have put Crane away for life, without any need for the murder charges. "Which explains why Crane was so desperate to stop him," Jack replied. "These photographs prove the scope of the conspiracy in a way that testimony never could." The final item in the buried cache was a letter addressed to Jack Sullivan personally. With trembling hands, Jack opened the envelope and read Tom Bradley's final message. "Jack, if you're reading this, then I'm dead and you're probably in trouble for it. Crane has been planning something against both of us, and I suspect he intends to frame you for whatever happens to me. The evidence in this box should clear your name and expose the truth about his criminal operation. Your horse Dustfire is smarter than any animal I've ever seen. If anyone can find this evidence, it's him. Trust in his instincts and never doubt the bond between you. You're a good man in a world that needs more good men. Don't let them break your spirit. Your friend, Tom Bradley." Jack's hands shook as he finished reading the letter. Tom Bradley had known he was going to die, had suspected that Jack would be framed for his murder, and had taken steps to ensure that justice would eventually be served. The man's courage and foresight were humbling. But more than that, Bradley had understood Dustfire's exceptional abilities before anyone else. He'd counted on the horse's intelligence to lead investigators to the hidden evidence, placing his faith in an animal that most people dismissed as incapable of complex reasoning. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Dustfire appeared at the cemetery gate, having apparently followed their scent trail from the church. The horse approached the group with his usual calm intelligence, but his attention was focused on something beyond the three men. Crawford noticed the horse's alertness and drew his gun. "What is it, Dustfire? What do you sense?" The answer came in the form of hoofbeats approaching from the direction of town. A lone rider was coming fast, and in the gathering darkness, it was impossible to identify friend from foe. "Could be one of my deputies," Crawford said, but his tone suggested he wasn't taking any chances. The rider turned out to be Deputy Wilson, and his news was urgent. "Marshal, we just got word that 3 of Crane's men escaped from the territorial prison in Denver. They're believed to be heading this way, probably looking for revenge against the people who exposed their operation." Crawford's expression hardened. "How long ago did they escape?" 2 days. They could be here any time. The situation had suddenly become much more dangerous. Crane's remaining associates had nothing to lose and every reason to want Jack Sullivan dead. The man who had exposed their conspiracy and the horse who had made it possible were now prime targets for desperate criminals who knew they were facing life imprisonment or death sentences. "We need to get back to town and organize defenses," Crawford said. "If they're coming for Jack and Dustfire, we'll be ready for them." But as they prepared to leave the cemetery, Dustfire's behavior became increasingly agitated. The horse was staring into the darkness beyond the cemetery fence, his ears flat against his head and his muscles tensed for action. "They're already here," Jack said quietly, recognizing the signs of danger in his horse's posture. The final confrontation was about to begin, and this time the stakes were higher than just one man's life. The evidence they'd just recovered could bring down a criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government, but only if they survived long enough to present it to a federal court. In the distance, the sound of multiple horses approaching confirmed their worst fears. Crane's men had found them, and there would be no escape from the cemetery that had just yielded the evidence needed to ensure justice. The battle for truth was about to become a battle for survival, with only a federal marshal, a small-town deputy, a preacher, and an extraordinary horse standing between justice and the forces of corruption that would kill to keep their secrets buried forever. The three escaped convicts materialized from the darkness like vengeful spirits, their faces hard with the desperation of men who had nothing left to lose. Jake Morrison, Crane's former second-in-command, led the group with the cold calculation of a professional killer. Behind him rode Two-Shot Kelly, a gunfighter whose reputation for violence was matched only by his loyalty to anyone who paid well. The third man, Carlos Mendez, had been Crane's connection to smuggling operations across the Mexican border. "Well, well," Morrison called out as he dismounted 50 yards from the cemetery gate. "Jack Sullivan, the man who destroyed our whole operation, and Marshal Crawford, the federal dog who's been hunting us like animals." Crawford positioned himself behind a large headstone, his rifle trained on Morrison while calculating the odds of survival. 3 against 4 seemed reasonable until he remembered that Preacher Williams wasn't armed and Deputy Wilson was young and inexperienced in gunfights. "You're surrounded, Morrison," Crawford called out, hoping to buy time. "My other deputies will be here any minute." Morrison laughed harshly. "Nice try, Marshal. We've been watching this town for 2 days. Your men are scattered across the territory chasing ghosts while we came for the real prize." "Which is what exactly?" "Sullivan's life, for starters. That interfering bastard cost us everything, but more importantly, we want that evidence you just dug up. Crane told us all about Bradley's insurance policy before they transferred him to federal prison." Jack felt his blood run cold. If these men knew about the buried evidence, then the conspiracy was even more widespread than they'd realized. Someone with access to federal prisoners had passed information to Crane's remaining associates. Dustfire, meanwhile, had positioned himself between the armed men and his human companions. The horse's intelligence extended to tactical situations, and he seemed to understand that his mobility and unpredictability could be valuable assets in the coming fight. "Here's what's going to happen," Morrison continued. "You're going to hand over that evidence box and walk away. Sullivan stays behind to pay for what he's done. Nobody else has to die tonight." "Counteroffer," Crawford replied. "You surrender now, and I guarantee you'll live to see trial instead of dying in this cemetery." Two-Shot Kelly spat into the dust. "We didn't break out of prison to surrender to a washed-up marshal and a horse-loving drifter." The standoff stretched taut like a guitar string ready to snap. In the fading light, each man calculated angles, distances, and probabilities of survival. But it was Dustfire who acted first, demonstrating once again that his intelligence surpassed normal animal instincts. The horse suddenly reared up and screamed a sound of rage and challenge that startled everyone present. In that moment of distraction, he charged directly at Two-Shot Kelly's horse, causing the animal to panic and throw its rider to the ground. The action broke the stalemate into chaos. Crawford's rifle cracked, sending Jake Morrison diving for cover behind a weathered monument. Deputy Wilson managed to get off one shot before Carlos Mendez's return. Fire forced him behind Sarah Bradley's headstone. Preacher Williams, showing surprising presence of mind, grabbed the evidence box and crawled toward the relative safety of the old oak tree. Jack found himself caught in the open with only his sidearm against 3 experienced killers. But Dustfire had created an opportunity, and Jack took it, rolling behind a large memorial stone as bullets whined overhead. Two-Shot Kelly had recovered from his fall and was taking careful aim at Crawford when Dustfire charged again, this time directly at the gunfighter. Kelly's shot went wide as he threw himself sideways to avoid the horse's hooves, but his evasive action put him in Jack's line of sight. Jack's pistol spoke once, and Kelly collapsed with a cry of pain, clutching his shoulder. The odds had shifted slightly in favor of the law, but Morrison and Mendez were still deadly threats in the gathering darkness. "That horse is a menace," Morrison shouted as Dustfire continued to create chaos among their horses. "Shoot the damned animal." But killing Dustfire proved easier said than done. The Mustang seemed to anticipate where bullets would be fired, dodging and weaving with an intelligence that made him nearly impossible to target. More importantly, his actions kept the escaped convicts off balance, preventing them from coordinating their attack effectively. Crawford used the distraction to advance to better cover, his rifle ready for any target that presented itself. He'd been in similar situations during his 20 years as a federal marshal, but he'd never had an animal ally whose tactical instincts rivaled those of a trained soldier. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since the convicts had appeared, the forces of law had hope of survival. The firefight intensified as Morrison and Mendez realized their tactical advantage was slipping away. Morrison had positioned himself behind a large granite monument that provided excellent cover, while Mendez had found a spot near the cemetery's rear wall that gave him a clear field of fire across the burial ground. "Carlos, pin them down while I flank around the right side," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. But Dustfire had other plans. The horse had been observing the battle with the calculating intelligence of a military strategist, and he'd identified Morrison as the primary threat. With a burst of speed that caught everyone off guard, Dustfire charged directly at Morrison's position, forcing the outlaw to abandon his cover or risk being trampled. Morrison rolled away from the horse's hooves, but his evasive action put him in the open where Crawford's rifle could find him. The marshal's shot took Morrison in the leg, sending him sprawling behind a smaller headstone that provided inadequate protection. "Jake!" Mendez called out, his concern for his wounded leader causing him to expose himself for a crucial second. Deputy Wilson, showing more courage than anyone had expected from the young lawman, took advantage of Mendez's momentary distraction to advance to a better position. His shot missed, but it forced Mendez to duck behind the cemetery wall and lose sight of his targets. The tactical situation had shifted dramatically in favor of the law, but the wounded outlaws were far from finished. Two-Shot Kelly, despite his shoulder wound, managed to draw his backup pistol and was looking for targets among the headstones. Jack found himself in a deadly game of cat and mouse with Kelly, each man trying to anticipate the other's movements among the maze of burial markers. The gathering darkness made accurate shooting nearly impossible, but it also provided concealment for both hunter and hunted. That's when Dustfire demonstrated his most remarkable ability yet. The horse began moving systematically through the cemetery, not randomly but with obvious purpose, driving Kelly away from positions that would give him clear shots at Jack. It was as if Dustfire understood the tactical situation completely and was actively working to protect his master. "That animal's coordinating with them," Mendez shouted in frustration, as another of his potential shots was blocked by Dustfire's strategic positioning. Morrison, bleeding heavily from his leg wound but still dangerous, managed to work his way closer to where Preacher Williams was protecting the evidence box. The old minister had shown remarkable courage throughout the battle, but he was unarmed and vulnerable. "Preacher!" Crawford called out in warning, but Morrison already had his gun trained on Williams. "Drop your weapons, or the holy man dies," Morrison commanded, his voice tight with pain, but still carrying deadly intent. For a moment, the cemetery fell silent, except for the sound of heavy breathing and the distant whinny of frightened horses. Crawford and Jack both had clear shots at Morrison, but the outlaw had positioned himself so that any missed shot might hit Preacher Williams. It was a perfect standoff, exactly the kind of situation that Morrison had been counting on to turn the tide of battle back in his favor. But he'd forgotten about Dustfire. The horse had been quietly maneuvering through the shadows, using his exceptional night vision to position himself behind Morrison's location. With perfect timing, Dustfire reared up and brought his hooves down on Morrison's gun arm, the impact sending the weapon flying into the darkness. Morrison screamed in pain as bones snapped under the horse's weight, but his cry was cut short as Jack's bullet found its mark. The outlaw leader collapsed beside a weathered headstone, his threat finally ended. Carlos Mendez, seeing his leader fall and realizing that the situation was hopeless, threw down his weapon and raised his hands in surrender. "Don't shoot, I give up." The battle was over almost as suddenly as it had begun. Crawford emerged from cover with his rifle trained on the surrendering outlaw, while Deputy Wilson began securing two-shot Kelly, who was still conscious despite his wound. Jack holstered his pistol and walked over to where Dustfire stood guard over Morrison's body. The horse seemed to understand that the danger had passed, and his posture relaxed from combat alertness to his normal calm intelligence. "I don't believe what I just witnessed," Crawford said, shaking his head in amazement. "That horse fought like a trained cavalry mount, better than most soldiers I've known." Preacher Williams, still clutching the evidence box that had nearly cost him his life, approached Dustfire with something approaching reverence. "This animal saved us all. There's no other way to put it." As dawn approached, the aftermath of the battle became clear. Morrison was dead. Two-shot Kelly would survive to stand trial, and Carlos Mendez had already begun providing information about the remaining members of Crane's organization in exchange for lenient treatment. More importantly, the evidence that Tom Bradley had hidden was now secure and could be used to prosecute the corrupt officials who had enabled Crane's criminal empire. Justice would finally be served, not just for Tom Bradley's murder, but for all the innocent people who had suffered under the conspiracy's protection. Jack stood beside Dustfire as the sun rose over the cemetery, both of them exhausted but victorious. The horse had proven once again that the bond between them transcended normal relationships between humans and animals. They were partners in the truest sense, each understanding and supporting the other in ways that most people would never experience. "Well, boy," Jack said softly, running his hand along Dustfire's neck, "I think we've found our calling." The horse whinnied softly in response, and Jack could swear there was satisfaction in the sound, the contentment of a job well done, and justice finally served. 6 months later, Jack Sullivan rode into Deadman's Bluff, wearing the silver star of a federal deputy marshal, with Dustfire moving beneath him with the confident gait of a horse who had earned legendary status throughout the territory. The town had changed in their absence, new businesses had opened, the courthouse had been expanded, and there was a general sense of prosperity that came from honest commerce rather than the shadow of criminal conspiracy. Mary Beth Carson emerged from her saloon with a smile that lit up the entire street. "Well, look what the wind blew back into town," she called out, though her joy at seeing them was unmistakable. "Mary Beth," Jack replied, tipping his hat as he dismounted. "Good to see you again. And Dustfire," she added, offering the horse a sugar cube she'd been saving for just such an occasion, the famous four-legged detective himself. The reunion was warm but brief. Jack and Dustfire had returned to Deadman's Bluff for a specific purpose, to attend the dedication of a monument that the town had commissioned in Tom Bradley's honor. The simple granite marker would stand in the town square, bearing the inscription, "Thomas Bradley, a man who stood for truth." But there was another dedication as well, one that surprised Jack when Sheriff Morrison explained it to him. The townspeople had also commissioned a bronze plaque to be mounted near the courthouse, honoring Dustfire's role in exposing the conspiracy and saving innocent lives. "In memory of the extraordinary intelligence and loyalty of Dustfire," Morrison read from the plaque, "who proved that justice can come from the most unexpected places." Jack felt a lump in his throat as he read the inscription. Dustfire, meanwhile, seemed to understand that the ceremony was somehow connected to him, though he maintained his usual dignified composure. Judge Whitman, who had stayed in town to oversee the final prosecution of Crane's co-conspirators, approached them with a thick folder of legal documents. "Jack, I thought you'd be interested to know that the federal investigation has wrapped up successfully. 17 corrupt officials have been convicted, 43 wrongly imprisoned men have been freed, and over $200,000 in stolen property has been returned to its rightful owners." The scope of what they'd accomplished still took Jack's breath away. What had started as a simple case of murder in a small frontier town had exposed a criminal conspiracy that reached into 7 territories and affected hundreds of lives. "None of it would have been possible without Dustfire," Jack said, patting his horse's neck. "He saw the truth when all of us were blind to it." "Speaking of which," Whitman continued, "I've been asked to present you with something from the territorial governor." He handed Jack an official-looking document with ribbons and seals that marked it as coming from the highest levels of government. Jack read it with growing amazement. It was a commendation recognizing Dustfire as an honorary deputy marshal, the first animal in territorial history to receive such recognition. "They want to make him official?" Jack asked incredulously. "Apparently, your reputation has reached all the way to the capital. There are 6 other cases where territorial marshals have requested your assistance specifically because of Dustfire's abilities. The governor decided that if a horse can solve crimes better than most humans, that horse deserves official recognition." Preacher Williams, who had been standing nearby listening to the conversation, stepped forward with his own gift. "Jack, I've been working on something ever since that night in the cemetery." He handed Jack a leather-bound journal. "It's the complete story of what happened here, Tom's murder, the investigation, the conspiracy, and Dustfire's role in exposing the truth. I thought it should be recorded properly, so future generations will understand what really happened." Jack opened the journal and read the first few pages, marveling at Williams's attention to detail and his ability to capture not just the facts, but the emotional impact of their ordeal. "This is remarkable, Preacher, thank you. There's one more thing," Williams added with a smile. "I've already sent copies to newspapers in Denver, San Francisco, and New York. Dustfire's story is going to be known from coast to coast." As the formal ceremonies concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Jack found himself standing alone with Dustfire in the town square, surrounded by the monuments to justice and loyalty they'd helped create. The horse seemed content, his intelligent eyes reflecting satisfaction with a job well done. "You know, boy," Jack said quietly, "Tom Bradley was right about you. You really are something special." Dustfire nuzzled his master's hand, a gesture of affection that had become their personal signal of understanding and partnership. They'd been through trials that would have broken lesser bonds, but their relationship had only grown stronger. Mary Beth approached them as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the square. "You'll be staying for supper, I hope. I've got a new cook who makes the best beef stew this side of Denver." "We'd be honored," Jack replied, "but we leave at dawn. Marshal Crawford has a new case for us in Colorado, cattle rustlers who've been hitting ranches along the Arkansas River. More criminals to catch?" "Always more criminals to catch, but now we know how to find them." As they walked toward Mary Beth's saloon, Jack reflected on how much his life had changed since that terrible morning when he'd found Tom Bradley's body. He'd been a drifter then, a man without purpose or direction. Now he was part of something larger, a mission to bring justice to places where corruption had taken root. And he had the perfect partner for that mission. Dustfire had proven that intelligence and loyalty could overcome even the most sophisticated criminal conspiracies. Together, they would continue the work they'd begun in Deadman's Bluff, protecting the innocent and exposing those who used power and corruption to harm others. The sun set over the town that had become their spiritual home, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that promised fair weather ahead. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new mysteries to solve, and new opportunities to prove that justice could prevail when good people and good horses refused to give up. But tonight, they would rest in the company of friends who understood the value of what they'd accomplished. The bond between a man and his horse had saved innocent lives, exposed a criminal conspiracy, and restored faith in justice to a community that had almost lost hope. In the growing darkness, the bronze plaque honoring Dustfire caught the last rays of sunlight, its inscription serving as a permanent reminder that heroes come in all forms, sometimes on 4 legs rather than 2, sometimes with hearts full of loyalty rather than heads full of schemes. Justice had been served in Deadman's Bluff, and the legend of the cowboy and his extraordinary horse would live on long after they'd ridden into their next adventure, following the trail wherever it might lead in their endless pursuit of truth.